Good evening. It's great to see so many of you here. We usually have a large and great audience, but today we have a particularly good audience. Thank you very much for joining us tonight for our interesting event on From Stalin and Khrushchev to Putin, the development of Russian autocracy from World War II to the very present. It's a great pleasure to welcome you again to the Krasno Global Events Series here at UNC. We have four special guests today. There's Professor Hiroaki Kuromiya. He joins us from Indiana University, though he is actually right now in Massachusetts, but he is normally a professor at Indiana University. Then Professor William Taubman joins us from Amherst College in Massachusetts. And Professor Don Rawley joins us here from UNC in Chapel Hill. And Professor Angela Stent joins us from Georgetown University in Washington, DC. I'm sure we will have a most enlightening evening. I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I've been organizing the Krasno Global Events Series since 2012, and we are still going strong. As you know, the Krasno Events Series at UNC always deals with issues of great global concern. We have a website, krasnoevents.com, and we have a popular YouTube channel that is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. And please sign up for our mailing list, and you will be informed regularly about all our exciting events. Just send me an email or go to the website and sign up to our mailing list. All our speakers today will talk for no more than 10 minutes, and then I will ask them a few questions. And then we will open it up to questions from you, the audience. As always, please submit your questions via the Q&A session at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our excellent two Krasno assistants today, Brianna Weaver and Pete Velasmil, will select the most interesting questions and read them out aloud. Please mention your name and your location when writing down a question. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you tonight to our Krasno event at UNC on From Stalin and Khrushchev to Putin, the development of Russian autocracy from World War II to the very present. Our first speaker tonight is Professor Hiroaki Kuromiya. Hiroaki is a professor of history at Indiana University in Bloomington. Before coming to the US, he was at the University of Cambridge in the UK. And last year, Hiroaki was a fellow and a member of the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Hiroaki is a most prolific scholar and writer. Among his many books are his very well-regarded book, Stalin, Profile in Power, Longman 2005, and also, for example, his book, Conscience on Trial, The Fate of 14 Pacifists in Stalin's Ukraine in 1952 and 1953. And that was published by the University of Toronto Press in 2012. And he has just told me that he is about to finish a new book on Stalin and China, which will hopefully come out pretty soon. Today, Hiroaki Kuromiya will enlighten us about Stalin, how Stalin came to power and how he managed hanging on to power. And of course, a few days ago, it was the 68th anniversary of Stalin's death in 1953. Thank you, Hiroaki, for joining us tonight, and over to you.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction. So I'll be short, and I'd like to discuss Stalin, how Stalin got power and how he maintained it. Now, there is during the Stalin time, it was often said that Stalin became a Soviet czar, a new autocrat. In fact, Stalin didn't really mind such a characterization of his power. He said, quote, "The people need a czar," unquote. Of course, the Russian czars inherited their power, but Stalin had to gain his power through bitter political struggles. So how did he do it? I think the most important strength Stalin had over his rivals, such as Trotsky, Bukharin, and others, was that he was a consummate politician who lived by politics alone. In comparison with his rivals, Stalin was largely devoid of intellectual vanity, desire for fame, and many other human weaknesses that often fail politicians as politicians. Lenin also said about Stalin that Stalin was devoid of sentimentality. Stalin himself knew that politics is a dirty business. And if one wants to keep his hands clean, he should not be in the business of politics. So he was consciously in the business of politics. He was a politician and he lived by politics alone. Other characters also helped him. Stalin was an extraordinarily patient listener. He was also, of course, a demagogue, but he was not just a simple demagogue, but one who chose carefully demagogy and disinformation that worked politically. And this is relatively easy in a country of one-party dictatorship. Now, once Stalin's arch enemy, Hitler said about Stalin, quote, "He's a beast, but he's a beast on the grand scale," unquote. Well, beast or not, Stalin in fact understood human relations very well and used his understanding for his politics. He knew whom to choose to achieve his political ends, and he also knew very well how to use them. So, in a word, Stalin was a consummate politician, and there is evidence that Stalin trusted Stalin. I'm sorry. There is evidence that Lenin trusted Stalin as a politician more than he did anyone else in his entourage, including Trotsky, Bukharin, Pyatakov, and so on. So, in this sense, it's no surprise at all that Stalin was a victor in the struggle for power. This happened in the course of the 1920s. Now, having said all this, I have to emphasize that Stalin was far more than merely a consummate politician. He was utterly ruthless, cruel and violent, and certainly, as Lenin said, devoid of sentimentality. He killed untold numbers of people. So terror, political terror, was an essential tool for Stalin to maintain his dictatorial and autocratic power. There was much debate in the 1980s and 1990s about whether Stalin actually had a social base for his power. No doubt, Stalin had many supporters. Every dictator enjoyed some support. Hitler was no exception. Trump was no exception in a democratic society. Now, after 3 decades of intense archival work in the formerly closed Soviet archives, we can say that it is almost impossible to know how much support Stalin actually enjoyed in Soviet society. We are dealing with a dictatorship where there was say no free elections, no free press, no free opinion polls, and so on. So any critical sentiment was driven underground. As a result, even the seemingly almighty Soviet secret police could not have known the political mood of the population. So at this stage, it's almost impossible for us to make any good judgment on this matter. There is no evidence really that Stalin was particularly concerned about the masses of people who are in favor or against the Soviet regime. He didn't seem to have been particularly concerned about this issue. But we do know that he certainly intimidated the population into submission by terror, intimidated them into submission. Unlike Hitler, Stalin did manage to create political, military, and professional cadres who were dedicated to him and Soviet communism. And Hitler envied Stalin in this regard. I tried, I couldn't do it. I could not wait for 20 years to create my own Nazi, cadres, manning military, government, and so on. And during World War II, for example, Stalin's military and political commanders were by and large loyal to him. There were very few cases of all treachery, except for people who were captured, like Vlasov and others, whereas Hitler's cadres were not always loyal. We know some cases, of course. So it's all just a few more minutes, so I'd like to conclude my discussion. No, probably Stalin's autocratic rule was rather unique. It's very difficult to find a regime that was very similar to it. Of course, there are many politicians dedicated to politics, but there were and are very few who lived and live by politics alone. Other temptation, money, sex, fame, vanity, all these things often fail many politicians. All the same, Stalin's successors, about whom my colleagues will discuss this evening, they did take many pages from Stalin's political playbook, including, say, Putin's hybrid war and so on. However, in two critical respects, Stalin's rule was not replicated by his successors, including Putin. One is, of course, mass terror. No one after Stalin resorted to mass terror because it was so traumatic. They couldn't do it. Stalin did. They couldn't. The other is that Stalin kept the Soviet Union largely isolated, insulated from the outside world. In other words, the population had no way really to compare Soviet society with other societies, capitalist societies, and so on. And this isolation did help Stalin's anti-foreign propaganda and demagoguery. But after Stalin's death, such kind of isolationism was no longer tenable or possible. And indeed, in the late Stalin era, Stalin knew that he was slowly losing his grip on Soviet society because he could not isolate Soviet society after World War II as he did before World War II. In other words, war opened up the Soviet Union to Nazi Germany, Italy, and so on, and later to Eastern Europe. And that was why I think he became so increasingly erratic towards the end of his life. That's about what I wanted to discuss.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Let me just ask you, there's always the rumor that Lenin really wanted to avoid Stalin becoming leader of the Soviet Union after his death. Is there anything in that, or is that all exaggerated?
Debated whether Lenin's last testament was forgery or not, at least some parts. This was proposed by a Russian historian called Sakharov. In my own book, I said that was a possibility. I didn't say it was true or not. Kotkin agreed with me more or less. He would also said it was a possibility. There was no real proof at this stage. Russian politicians are divided. It's not possible to know whether they were forged or not. But it may, because if indeed Lenin's widow Krupskaya was involved in this forgery, it explains why Krupskaya was silent when Lenin's closest comrades were being killed by Stalin in the 1930s. Krupskaya did not speak up. So there is a possibility. Of course, Lenin said critical things about Stalin, Trotsky, and everyone at the dinner table with Krupskaya. Krupskaya must have known what kind of nasty things Lenin said about Stalin, Trotsky, Buhari, and so on. So some of these remarks may have been transcribed as if they were Lenin's testament. That's all I can say at this stage. We may never know.
Okay. Thank you. And regarding, come to the end of his life, he died because of a stroke on the 5th of March, 1953. Apparently, help was slow in coming deliberately. They wanted to let him die. No one had any interest in making him survive. Is this correct, or is that again an exaggeration?
It's quite possible, yes. Certainly, Beria may not have wanted him to stay alive. They are also afraid of providing medical help, and many of the doctors were already in jail, so they probably want many competent doctors. So yes, it's possible that they wanted him to die or not to revive. That's certainly possible. Mm-hmm.
That is what you think yourself, yeah?
Well, there are some research essays about whether Beria was immediately killed or not. So yes, that's quite possible. If I were one of them, this may be better for Stalin not to, revive. That's totally understandable. So yes, I would say it was perfectly possible, but final conclusion cannot be made at this stage.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. That's very helpful. And our next speaker is Professor William Taubman. Bill Taubman is Bertrand Snell Professor of Political Science at Amherst College in Massachusetts. Bill is among the nation's most well-known and well-regarded scholars on the former Soviet Union and Russia. He has published many books and articles, and particularly well-known became his biography of Khrushchev, the man and his era, which came out with Norton in 2004 and won him the prestigious Pulitzer Prize for biography and also the National Book Critics Circle Award for biography. Recently, Bill Taubman has published a biography on another well-known Soviet politician, that is Gorbachev, his life and times. And as Gorbachev turned 90 only a few days ago, this, of course, is very well worth reading. It came out with Simon & Schuster in 2017. Today, Bill Taubman will talk about Khrushchev, his rise to power and how he managed to stay there, until he got toppled eventually in 1964. But Khrushchev at least was the first Soviet leader who enjoyed a sort of happy retirement, I guess. Over to you, Bill. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Indeed, it's a pleasure to be with you all. To sum up the Khrushchev story, I would say two things. He carried out an important break with Stalin and Stalinism in the Soviet Union. That's the first part. The second is that the break was partial. It was tortured even as it was happening. And as you will hear from Don Rawley when he talks about Brezhnev, it was reversed in large measure by his own successor, Leonid Brezhnev. Well, in what did the break consist? Khrushchev, in the famous secret speech he delivered at the 20th Party Congress in 1956, denounced Stalin, unmasked Stalin. And he also proceeded to release and rehabilitate millions of Stalin's victims who were either still in prison or had been killed in prison. In addition, another part of the break with Stalinism is that Khrushchev tried to ease the Cold War with the West. And he succeeded in part. You'll remember the nuclear test ban treaty of 1963 that he arrived at with President Kennedy. Thirdly, Khrushchev tried to change the Soviet Union by revitalizing agriculture, which had stagnated under Stalin, reviving industry, economic growth had slowed, and carrying out, or at least facilitating, a kind of thaw in culture, allowing people to write more freely and read more freely. So these were the elements of the break with Stalin. But and I underline but, the de-Stalinization process was carried out in a limited way and erratically. It was partly reversed by Khrushchev himself, and as I said, more so by Brezhnev. And the thaw, the change, the de-Stalinization, when it helped to lead to the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, Khrushchev crushed that revolution with Soviet troops. Furthermore, the other new elements of his domestic policy were erratic too. He was constantly reorganizing the management of the economy. Agriculture continued to stagnate despite his efforts to energize it. And although the intelligentsia, for the most part, loved the de-Stalinization process that he began, he developed a kind of love-hate relationship with the intelligentsia. And all of this resulted, as Klaus said, in his ouster in 1964. And actually, there was an attempt before that in 1957 to oust him by his colleagues in the Kremlin. That did not succeed. He turned the tables on them. Now, the second question I want to ask is, what explains this contradictory pattern? And I would first cite a series of what you might call impersonal factors, causes. For example, the Stalin system that Hiroaki described had in many ways run aground, to the point that even Stalinists, the arch-Stalinists in the Kremlin after Stalin died, recognized the need for some changes at home and an effort to somewhat ease the Cold War. But there were limits, impersonal limits, one might say, because, for example, the leadership as a whole wanted to maintain control, even as they eliminated the arbitrary terror that had been the center of Stalin's rule. The economic system, the command economy, was very hard to alter. And in fact, they didn't really try to do it at all. And the Cold War, as it had been carried out under Stalin, had created deep mutual suspicions in both East and West, which proved an obstacle to easing it when Khrushchev tried to do so. But apart from these impersonal causes of the pattern I described, I want to focus now on the personal role of Khrushchev himself. First thing I'd say was that although he was an anti-Stalinist, he was still a Stalinist. How could he not be? He had grown up in Stalin's shadow, working as Stalin's henchman, indoctrinated with Stalin's ideas, and although he tried to liberate himself, as well as his country, from that, he didn't succeed doing so entirely. And I would say, and also this is very important, Khrushchev was unique as compared to his fellow leaders in a couple of ways that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And that uniqueness demands us looking back at his character to explain what he did. Because if what he had done was simply what others would have done in his place, we could say, well, they were all motivated by the ideas they shared, or they were all reacting to the situation they faced, which demanded certain responses. But when a leader like Khrushchev is unique in what he does, you have to look at his character and look at his personality. The two most important things I would argue that Khrushchev did as leader, one was giving that secret speech denouncing Stalin in 1956, and the other was sending missiles to Cuba in 1962, which brought the world as close as it's ever come to nuclear war. And I would argue that both of those were virtually unique to him. The secret speech in 56 might have been given by Beria, Stalin's police chief who survived him, and who, as he aspired to become Stalin's successor, was trying to cleanse his name and reputation of all the blood that he had helped Stalin to spill. So it's possible Beria might have done it, but Beria was gone by 1956, eliminated by Khrushchev and the others in the Kremlin who surprised him, arrested him, and executed him. 1956, 1962, the Cuban missiles, well, you could argue others might have done it, but I would make a stronger argument, I think, that no one else would have done it. They all said later they thought it was nuts. It was harebrained scheming, and I believe them. It was a harebrained scheme to think you could ship missiles and troops 10,000 miles across the open ocean and move them through the Cuban jungles and set them up and have them mistaken for palm trees. This was a crazy scheme, and only Khrushchev, I believe, did it. Now, let me elaborate a little bit on both of these decisions by trying to explain how they reflected Khrushchev's character, his biography, and his psyche. Let me take his biography quickly, first. Khrushchev had only 2 or 3 years of formal education. He was smart, he was shrewd, he was ambitious, but as Ernst Niezvestny, the man who designed the monument at his grave, said, and Niezvestny was an artist, a sculptor, Khrushchev was the crudest man he had ever met. Khrushchev was also, I discovered in writing his biography, as a young man, a quite decent person. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke, he didn't chase women. And if you've had any dealings over the years with Soviet bureaucrats or leaders, you know this is a miracle. Of course, he wasn't yet a miracle, but nonetheless, I believe he was a decent man until he was corrupted by power and by Stalin. Stalin was his mentor, but Stalin was also his tormentor. And Khrushchev resented it. I'm going to quote something I learned as I was doing my research, namely that as early as 1938, when Khrushchev had just taken over as the Communist Party boss of the Ukraine, he paid a visit to his close childhood friend. And with nobody else in the room except the friend's daughter, who later told me about this conversation, Khrushchev invited his friend, who was not in the Communist Party, to join it. And the man said, "I'm not joining that party." He said, if UNC regulations will allow me to quote directly, "To join that party is to join shit. You've destroyed the real party, the one you joined back then, the one that included," and then this friend named 3 leading Bolsheviks whom Stalin had purged. At this point, Khrushchev answered, "Don't blame me for all that. I'm not involved in that. When I can, I'll settle with that." And then he used the word Mudakshvili. Stalin's real name was Jugashvili, but Mudakshvili is a curse. "I'll settle with that Mudakshvili in full. I don't forgive him for any of them. Not Kirov, not Yakir, not Tukhachevsky, not the simplest worker or peasant." So what I'm saying is that when Khrushchev gave that secret speech, which began to change the Soviet Union at the time, and which you might even say began the process of eroding and eventually collapsing the Soviet system many years later, it was partly as an act of personal repentance. It was also a move in the power struggle to succeed Stalin, because the other contenders for the top spot had been closer to Stalin than Khrushchev was. But this particular unique personal element helps to explain this absolutely central development of the Khrushchev years. Let's turn finally to the Cuban Missile Crisis. There are several explanations that people give, scholars give, and others, to explain why Khrushchev put those missiles in Cuba. One, to defend Cuba against an American invasion, following up on the abortive Cuban exile invasion at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. Two, to rectify the strategic nuclear imbalance, which we thought in the United States favored the Soviet Union. We called it the missile gap, but it turned out actually to favor the United States by a huge margin. And three, the third possible reason for putting those missiles in Cuba was to set the stage for a renewal of pressure on Berlin, which Khrushchev had been pressuring since 1958 to get the Westerners out, to turn it into a free city, and to arrange in this process the Western recognition of East Germany as a sovereign state. Well, after doing my research, I concluded that these three reasons were partly true. These were things he had in his mind. I could also name a couple of others, but I won't. But again, the personal enters into this. And how does it do so? Well, by 1962, many things were going wrong in the Soviet Union. Economic growth had slowed. Agriculture was so bad that they had to import tons of grain from the West. Khrushchev was at war with the intelligentsia, which had supported him in the beginning. And Khrushchev was mortified, I think, by all of these developments, particularly because one of the ways he had obtained power, well, first of all, survived Stalin and then defeated Stalin, his rivals, to succeed Stalin, was that Khrushchev had, in some ways, taken advantage of his minimal education to play the fool, the jester in Stalin's court. And what had happened now by 1962 was it looked as if he had failed. The fool had gained power, but he was failing to govern successfully. And so my interpretation of sending those missiles to Cuba was that it was a kind of desperate effort at a kind of cure-all for all of his troubles, a triumph which would set his country agog with respect for what he had done, set the world back, recognizing what he had done. But of course, it turned out not to be a cure-all, but rather a failure. And one last point about his psyche, not his biography, but his psyche. When I worked on Khrushchev, one of the things I discovered was that when President Kennedy, in the spring of 1961, decided to embark on a summit conference with Khrushchev, which occurred that summer in June in Vienna, he commissioned the CIA to do a study of Khrushchev's personality. Now, they don't declassify those things, but I found somebody who'd been on the panel of psychiatrists who'd been brought together to do this. And I learned that this panel of psychiatrists, after having studied Khrushchev and talked to people who had known him and interviewed him and all the rest, came to the conclusion that Khrushchev was hypomanic. Let me read you 2 or 3 sentences which constitute a definition of hypomania. Hypomanic person is elated, energetic, self-promoting, witty, and grandiose, overtly cheerful, highly social, given to idealization of others, work-addicted, flirtatious and articulate while covertly guilty about aggression toward others, corruptible, and listen to this, lacking a systematic approach in cognitive style, grand schemes, racing thoughts, extended freedom from ordinary physical requirements such as food and sleep, constantly up until exhaustion sets in. And to confirm that this was Khrushchev, I didn't rely entirely on American psychiatrists. I talked to the widow of American ambassador to Moscow in Khrushchev's time, Llewellyn Thompson. And Jane Thompson remembered that as Khrushchev and her husband and she flew to the United States in September 1959 for a madcap month, which is another story in itself in the United States, Jane Thompson said that Nina Khrushcheva, Khrushchev's wife, pointing to her husband, said to her, to Jane, he's either all the way up or all the way down. So what I'm saying is that I think of the decision to send the missiles to Cuba as a kind of manic episode. And I even entertained the thought that Khrushchev's failure to think through what might be the consequences, not only of the Cuban missiles, but of the secret speech, might have been related to this facet of his personality. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That was very enlightening. Let me ask you, initially after Stalin's death, it wasn't immediately Khrushchev who came to power, but it was Malenkov and also Bulganin to some extent. How did he manage to push them aside and to make himself leader?
Well, Malenkov turned out to be something of a weakling. He was a paper pusher. He was Stalin's clerk more than anything else. And he didn't put up much of a fight when Khrushchev began to organize the others against him. Bulganin was never really a contender to be the top leader. Khrushchev was the party leader, Bulganin was the prime minister, but everybody knew that Bulganin was something of a drunkard, an out-and-out womanizer chasing ballerinas all over the place, and misstating what should have been central points of Soviet policy. So he was never a rival. The other rival was Molotov, but Khrushchev, having organized and recruited Molotov to oppose Malenkov, then recruited Malenkov to oppose Molotov, and ended up defeating them all.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Going back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, in the end, it was a draw, or you can say Khrushchev got cold feet and gave in. What is your interpretation? Was it really Kennedy and the United States, or was it in the end the maturity of Khrushchev who realized what he had done in the first place and saved the world, so to speak?
I actually blame both Kennedy and Khrushchev for the crisis in the first place. Kennedy was engaged in all kinds of machinations designed to undermine Castro, and the Soviets did indeed interpret this as preparatory to another invasion, to which Khrushchev responded in part with those Cuban missiles. So that's how they both cooperated, or the opposite, to create the crisis. But once the crisis began, and it became clear to both of them that one logical and probable and almost, it seemed for a moment, inevitable consequence of the crisis could be nuclear war, they both summoned the maturity to retreat. Khrushchev said he would pull the missiles out, and Kennedy rejected the advice of most of his advisors, especially the military, to bomb the missile sites and engage in an all-out invasion of Cuba. So I credit them both, or discredit them both, with causing the crisis, but credit them both with solving it.
Thank you. And one last question before we have to go on. Tell us something about how he was pushed out in 1964, and whether or not, as I said at the beginning, he did have a sort of happy retirement and actually managed to smuggle out his memoirs, didn't he?
His retirement was happy only in the sense that he wasn't dead. Most of the others in Soviet history, the other leaders who were forced out, were buried soon thereafter, if not immediately. It was not, however, much more than house arrest. He had to live in his dacha, and he was watched and listened to, bugged, and all the rest. So it was only relatively happy. The reason it was so possible was that all his many mistakes and some of his achievements too had alienated alienated his colleagues in the Kremlin and deprived him of the support of other possible constituencies in Soviet society, so that when they moved against him, nobody, with the only exception of Anastas Mikoyan, his closest associate in the Kremlin, nobody defended him. Nobody came to his aid.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sure we will talk more about that in the question period. And that brings us to our third speaker, that is Professor Donald Rawley. Don is a J. Richard Judson Distinguished Professor of History here at UNC-Chapel Hill, and he just retired from his teaching duties, but continues to be a highly prolific scholar and writer. Don Rawley is also the former director of the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies here at UNC. Don has also published an awful lot. Particularly well known is his book, Soviet Baby Boomers, an oral history of Russia's Cold War generation, which came out with Oxford in 2013. And the students at UNC like this book a lot, I know for sure. At present, Don Rawley works on a biography of Leonid Brezhnev, that enigmatic and long-standing ruler of the Soviet Union who succeeded Khrushchev in 1964 and managed staying in power for 18 long years, from the 1960s to the early 1980s. And we all hope that Don's book will be out in a couple of years or so. Today, Don will give us already a preview of what he is going to say in his book, How Did Brezhnev Manage to Stay in Power for So Long? Over to you, Don.
Thanks, Klaus, so much. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, be it this evening or whatever part of the day it is for you.
And you are reporting live from Moscow to us.
I'm in Chapel Hill, holed up in my house, unfortunately. But Leonid Brezhnev was a total product of Stalin's affirmative action program for young workers and a Khrushchev protege, who, as Klaus mentioned, governed the Soviet Union, was General Secretary of the Communist Party from 1964 to 1982. And that's longer than anyone else except for Stalin. Yet, despite that fact that he was in power for 18 years, it wasn't until very recently that the first professional academic biography of Brezhnev was published. Now, why is that? Because as Klaus mentioned, I'm working on one. Well, when Gorbachev came to power and launched Perestroika, he has to justify reform for good reason. And of course, pinning the stagnation trope on the Brezhnev era, when the Soviet, a time of lost opportunity when the Soviet Union stagnated and now reform was necessary. That, of course, for good reason, meant that people had sort of lost interest and had dismissed Brezhnev. But I want to point out that from the start of the new millennium until 2018, so 17, 18 years, in national public opinion surveys in Russia, in response to the question, who was the most popular leader of the 20th century in Russia, the Soviet Union, Brezhnev came out on top. In 2018, he was displaced by Stalin, and then now they've added Putin to the mix, so it's gotten a little more complicated. Now, part of that reason, of course, is that the 10 years of Yeltsin's reign, the introduction of democracy and Western-style, capitalism, market capitalism to Russia, did not result in prosperity and all the things that I think people had hoped for. But they were extremely difficult years. So people began to look back rather nostalgically upon the Brezhnev era as the golden age of Soviet socialism, and when people had, quote unquote, confidence in tomorrow. Now, obviously, changing attitudes about Brezhnev would warrant new biographical studies. But there's more to it than that. We now have sources that simply were unavailable before to write a biography of Brezhnev. The former Communist Party of the Soviet Union archive has opened up its Brezhnev files, as well as Politburo minutes and other leading government organs. Most of those materials are now available, despite some difficulties sometimes in getting access owing to all sorts of things, including COVID. Moreover, the archives in the former republics of the Soviet Union are fully open. And I've worked, for instance, in Ukraine, in Dnipropetrovsk. I've worked in Moldova, and I worked in Kazakhstan, all places where Brezhnev had been prominent in the early part of his career. Finally, I want to point out that unlike any other Soviet leader, Brezhnev kept working notebooks, some people have called them diaries, from 1957 on. And they were published in Moscow several years ago in 3 volumes. He didn't pour out his soul on the pages of these papers, but he includes a lot of very interesting information that make it possible to get some insights into what made him tick. Now, how did he come to power? As we know, he came to power following a coup that overthrew Khrushchev, of which Brezhnev was one of its main architects, although even now, there are some major questions that remain unanswered about the conspiracy against Khrushchev. The former Communist Party archive had an exhibit of Brezhnev materials a few years back and regretted the fact that they couldn't find anything more on the conspiracy. It's usually personal reminiscences of what happened, but not by the key players. Keep in mind, this was a conspiracy. It was secret. So that's one reason that it's hard to get good sources on it. How did he stay in power? Well, I want to begin by saying that if we look at what the new leadership what the new leadership, how it responded to Khrushchev's many changes, the things it undid, that would help us understand why he was ousted. But one thing that the new leadership did not undo was Khrushchev's foreign policy. That is, they had the same accents in foreign policy as the Khrushchev years. Now, say more about that in a bit. But keep in mind that Brezhnev came to power as a result of a coup d'etat, conspiracy. He wanted at all costs to avoid one, right? Another one that might remove him from power. So just about all the sources are in agreement that he had great talents as a consensus builder. In fact, one of the tropes he liked to use was trust in cadres. That is, whereas Khrushchev moved people around and fired people and actually was going to split the party into two constituencies, Brezhnev did none of the above. If you were a good, loyal party boss, you could pretty much count on continuing in that capacity, unless you did something that was outrageous. The Kremlin presented the new leadership as a collective leadership, just as it had done in 1953 following Stalin's death. But by 1971, Brezhnev had emerged as first among equals. This was the year of the 24th Party Congress. It was clear that he was in charge of that. And from this point on, he clearly also took charge of Soviet foreign policy. In the milieu in which he grew up, he really was a grand master of the Soviet political chess game. Now, not everyone immediately understood this, but they would pay for this if necessary. And he achieved his goals with confidence, with certainty, relied very heavily on the party apparatus. He was conservative, he was cautious, he was unhurried, but he listened to his colleagues, unlike Khrushchev. He avoided sudden turns, he avoided major political innovations, and he preferred stability. And people were ready for stability. He was right for the times when he came to power. He had many friends. You may have heard reference to the Brezhnev Mafia. These were people that Brezhnev met early in his career and relied on and trusted, people from Ukraine, from Moldova, from Kazakhstan. He brought them to Moscow, and they occupied about 20 of them or so. They occupied key positions, and often they served as deputies under some Politburo members. So in a way, they may have been even watching. A good example here was Andropov, the head of the KGB. Although very close to Brezhnev, his deputy was a member of the Brezhnev Mafia, who certainly had a direct ear to Brezhnev about Andropov. Now, throughout his years in office, there were members of the Politburo who did not appreciate Brezhnev and even opposed him. And he got rid of them, but he did so with a very light touch, often dispatching them to diplomatic posts abroad or to lesser offices in Moscow or somewhere else. It's clear that he reached the pinnacle of power in April 1973. This was the first Central Committee plenum meeting at which he gave the keynote address, and there was no discussion. And what he said was word. Now, I have to say, he called this plenum in part to gain support among the Soviet leadership for his traveling to the United States, which he actually did that year. Now, as leader, Brezhnev had two goals: to improve the standard of living of the Soviet people and to guarantee peace. Now, I want to point out that one of the reasons he was so fondly remembered between 2000 and 2018 was precisely these efforts to improve the standard of living. People had confidence in tomorrow, and they remembered the good old Brezhnev years after the not so good Yeltsin years. But there are two things you remember about my introductory comments. I want them to be these two things. First of all, he was a Soviet man of peace. And this is something that I didn't expect to see so much in the sources, but it's overwhelming. It comes from all the sources. He experienced firsthand the horrors of World War I and World War II. He was the only member of the Politburo to have spent World War II in the trenches. True, he was a political officer and not a military officer, but he was at the front the entire war years. And he had a total emotional commitment to peace, which becomes much more pronounced in the 1970s. Second, if he had retired in 1975, it would have been impossible to have pinned the quote unquote stagnation trope on him. Brezhnev suffered, he had 2 heart attacks before coming to power, but he suffered a seizure in late 1974 during a summit meeting with President Gerald Ford, after which his health deteriorated precipitously. All the people who worked with Brezhnev who left written accounts speak of before and after. As one of them, Alexander Bovin, who was one of the most astute Soviet political observers, put it, I worked with 2 Brezhnevs, the healthy and the sick. They were different people, end quote. Now, this first Brezhnev was energetic, he loved life, and as Bovin stresses, he was far from stupid. He was not this mediocrity that sometimes he came to be portrayed as when he was the brunt of jokes later in his career. He had an outstanding mind, and you needed one to rule the Soviet Union for 18 years. After all, it was the other superpower. Now, I want to point out he wanted to retire, but his comrades wouldn't let him. I think this was another reason why his popularity after 2000, this became known. And I think Russians felt sorry for him, knowing that, if he had retired in 75, there wouldn't have been these spate of Brezhnev-era jokes that became so prominent in the Soviet Union. Now, importantly, Brezhnev became unconditionally committed to détente and to arms negotiation. He linked détente to his own personal success. He took responsibility for dealing with the Federal Republic of Germany and with the United States following 1971. He and Willy Brandt, for instance, were natural allies, and Brezhnev worked assiduously on the so-called Moscow Treaty that recognized post-war borders in Europe and renounced the use of force. When there were back-channel discussions about holding a summit with Nixon, there was a lot of opposition in the Kremlin toward this, owing to the uproar over the Vietnam War. Brezhnev actually clashed with some important Politburo members, such as the head of the armed forces, Marshal Grechko, over holding a summit meeting with Nixon. The 1972 summit, when Nixon visited Moscow, was deemed a success on both sides. It led to the signing of SALT I, and as I mentioned, Brezhnev came to the United States in 1973. And if we look, I guess we could call the high point of détente was the signing of the Helsinki Accords in 1975. Now, interestingly, the head of the CEO of Pepsi, Donald Kendall, he visited Moscow in 1973, and Brezhnev told him, "Those who struggle for peace are even more important than scientists battling to cure cancer." He genuinely believed this, and he saw himself in that role and capacity. Now, regarding his personality, after all, Khrushchev was had such an interesting personality. Brezhnev, again, I think there were so many jokes about Brezhnev after 1975. That's the image that stuck in people's minds. But Nixon, for instance, called him the best politician in the room, and he likened him to a big Irish labor boss, maybe a Mayor Daley, but with personality. Nixon commented on his booming voice, his strong personality, his animal magnetism, and his drive. Willy Brandt had very similar comments about him. And by the way, historian, or I should say poet come historian, the late Robert Conquest, who was at the Hoover Institute, he briefed Nixon before Nixon met with Brezhnev. And Conquest had dismissed Brezhnev and other leading Politburo members as third-rate politicians. Nixon later totally rejected this assessment and thought Conquest had it all wrong from the very start. Now, Brezhnev was not well educated, but he was not shy about saying, I don't know. And he asked lots of questions. He listened. Advisors were his books. He wasn't a reader. He was congenial in dealing with subordinates, unlike, say, Gorbachev. He wanted to be liked. He loved to tell stories. He was quite a raconteur. At parties, he would stand on a chair and recite poetry he had memorized in his youth as a young man. He loved hunting, fishing, soccer, driving luxury cars fast and dangerously. By the way, he had a collection of some 80 luxury cars. Most of them had been gifts from other foreign leaders during prominent meetings with him. Now, he died in office on November 10th, 1982, days after taking part in celebrations of the anniversary of the so-called Great October Socialist Revolution. I want to point out that back in 1964, when he had taken part in removing Khrushchev, at the time, the Soviet newspapers wrote that Khrushchev had been removed from office owing to his age and the condition of his health, that is, his ill health. Well, ironically, Brezhnev had less control here over his historical legacy. His age and his ill health, as I've suggested, were very, very much political actors already from the mid-1970s on.
Thank you, Ron. Don.
Pardon?
We need to come to a brief.
Yeah, I am, but I thank you. But sources are clear that he depleted himself in the fight for peace. My last comment, the memoirs of all of those, even those aides who didn't like him, they all emphasized he exhausted himself and his health for the cause of peace.
Thank you very much.
I want you to remember. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Let me quickly ask you, Brezhnev, as you indicated, had a good relationship with Nixon in the service of peace. He also had a good relationship in the same context of détente and rapprochement with Willy Brandt in West Germany. But Nixon and Willy Brandt didn't get on at all. So how did Brezhnev manage to get on with two very different people? Tell us.
Yeah, I think the fact that the things worked out so well with Willy Brandt, in part, let's face it, both men wanted the same thing. They had this common goal. They found it easy to talk to each other. And it's clear that from his diaries that Brezhnev did not think highly of Nixon before this. He saw him, he dismissed him as a political intriguer and a demagogue. But once Ostpolitik became such a success, it's very interesting. Brezhnev turned to Willy Brandt and asked him about Nixon. And Brandt played a crucial role here because he encouraged Brezhnev to be open-minded. Interestingly enough, Nixon turned to Willy Brandt as well and asked him about Brezhnev. And again, Brandt sort of suggested that Nixon keep an open mind. When they actually met, a real turning point, when Nixon arrived in Moscow, Brezhnev's translator, Sukhodrev, came to Nixon when he was getting settled into his accommodations and said, Brezhnev would like to see you right now. This was not part of the plan. And he met with Brezhnev only with the translator there. Obviously, people like Kissinger, Gromyko, they were furious about this. But it initiated a certain rapport that over time would develop between the two men. And ironically, during Watergate, Brezhnev was one of the last foreign leaders to support Nixon. And he wrote him actually a very touching letter wishing him well and wishing him fortitude.
Thank you very much. It sounds as if Willy Brandt brought Brezhnev and Nixon together.
To a certain extent.
Most interesting. That brings us to our fourth and final speaker today, and that is Professor Angela Stent of Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Angela is Professor of Government and Foreign Service. She is also the Director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown. Angela Stent is also active at the Brookings Institution think tank in D.C. Angela is among the nation's most well-known experts on recent Russian history and politics. She also served in the Office of Policy Planning in the US State Department and as a National Intelligence Officer on Russia and Eurasia. Angela Stent is also a very prolific scholar and author. Her book, The Limits of Partnership, US-Russian Relations in the 20th Century, came out with Princeton University Press in 2014. And her latest, most interesting book has a nice title, Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. That's very nice. And the publisher is 12 of the Hachette Book Group, and it came out in 2019. Today, Angela Stent will talk to us about Vladimir Putin and how Putin is still managing to stay in power in Russia. Over to you, Angela.
Thank you very much, Klaus, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this very interesting discussion. I will remind you that Vladimir Putin has described Stalin as an efficient manager, and last week, when he wrote a congratulatory message to President Gorbachev on his 90th birthday, he failed to mention any of Gorbachev's reforms. Putin, of course, is the man who has slowly restored the traditional Russian authoritarian state. So I will start off talking about where did Putin come from, and then something about how he's managed to stay in power now for 21 years. So Vladimir Putin, as you probably know, emerged from a hard-scrabble childhood in Leningrad to become a judo champion and then a law student. And then when he'd finished his legal studies, he decided he wanted to join the KGB. He actually tried to join the KGB as a teenager, and they turned him away and said, you know, go away, study, and come back, and then we'll have you. And so he spent 5 years as a young man, 1985 to 1990, in Dresden, in East Germany, as a KGB case officer. And in his 2000 autobiographical essay that was published about him, when he was asked what he did in East Germany, he said he was working with people and papers as a case officer. And then in November 1989, the mob banged on the door where the KGB and the East German Stasi were co-located in Dresden. The wall had just come down in Berlin, and they wanted to see their files. They wanted retribution, really, for what the Stasi particularly had done for them, done to them in the 40 years of the East German rule. Putin then called Moscow. He wanted some instructions about what to do, and he got no instructions. As he said again in this autobiographical essay, Moscow was silent. So he spent the night burning files in the furnace furiously. In the end, the furnace blew up, it collapsed. And apparently, again, according to what he has said about it, this experience made, of course, a lasting impression on him and really colored the way that he saw things going forward. So he then returned to the Soviet Union in 1990. He had missed the entire Gorbachev period, the entire period of glasnost and perestroika and ferment. He'd been in one of the most conformist communist countries in the Eastern Bloc, and he went back and he was unemployed. But his fortunes then picked up, and shortly after the Soviet collapse, he was in a position of being the deputy mayor or a deputy mayor in St. Petersburg, renamed after the Soviet collapse, responsible for foreign economic contacts. So his second incarnation after being a spy, a KGB agent, was as the man who was helping arrange St. Petersburg's transition from a state-controlled economy to this wild kind of capitalism. St. Petersburg in the 1990s really was part of the Wild East. And as I said, he then had many contacts with foreigners in a different capacity, obviously, trying to get them to invest in St. Petersburg. During that time, he got to know a coterie of people, many of whom are still close to him and are in Moscow with him now. And they all got quite rich in those wild days in St. Petersburg. Many of them belonged to something called the Ozero Dacha Collective. So a collective of people, dachas, their homes on the lake outside of St. Petersburg, and they all did really quite well. And then in 1996, the mayor of St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak, Putin's boss, was up for re-election, and he lost after what was a rather ugly and corrupt campaign. And I think the lesson that Putin himself drew from that is it's really not a good idea to contest elections unless you know what the outcome's going to be. So after the defeat of Sobchak, Putin did already have some patrons in St. Petersburg who then brought him to Moscow, and he had various positions there. I won't go into all of them, but the final one he had before becoming prime minister in 1999 was head of the FSB, which was one of the successors, of course, to the KGB. Now, at that point, President Boris Yeltsin was ailing. He was looking around for a successor. The Yeltsin era itself was pluralistic and chaotic. We've already heard about it. We can maybe talk about it more in the Q&A session. But the one institution that Yeltsin really didn't reform were the intelligence services, because as he himself told his first foreign minister, Andrei Kozyrov, that was the one institution that worked in the late Gorbachev era, according to him, and after the Soviet collapse. And then in 1998, while Putin was in Moscow, Russia suffered an economic collapse. The ruble collapsed. People lost their savings. It was a very dark economic time for the Russian population. And at this point, Yeltsin was even more ailing, and he really wanted to leave power, and the people around him were looking for a successor to him. And just to go back to a theme that we've heard, in the 1,000 years of Russian history that preceded Putin, there are only a few models of succession: death by natural or sometimes unnatural causes, popular revolution, and a palace coup, as is what happened to Nikita Khrushchev. And Yeltsin was the first Russian leader to engineer a peaceful, voluntary, managed transition of power. Of course, Gorbachev also, has been able to live his life out. It was peaceful, but of course it wasn't voluntary. But in the Yeltsin case, it was going to be voluntary. And he picked Putin as his successor after going through a number of other candidates, because he was told that Putin was loyal, and that Putin would guarantee the interests of the Yeltsin family once Boris Yeltsin stood aside. And indeed, Putin did that. He kept his word. Neither Yeltsin nor any members of his family were ever prosecuted for anything that they did. But the same was not true of the oligarchs who surrounded Yeltsin. And it's important to remember that when we come and talk about what might happen in the future in Russia. In the beginning, nobody knew really who Putin was. He had two identities, again, the KGB officer and the economic modernizer. He inherited a country in economic freefall, where considerable power had devolved to the different regions of Russia. Central power had been weakened. And on coming to power in 2000, he promised two things. He would restore a strong state in Russia, and he would make Russia once again a great power. And both of these things were what Russia's natural entitlement was, to have a strong state with a strong leader and to be a great power again. But he did act quite slowly in the beginning, feeling his way out. And in the very beginning, a number of Westerners who met with him in his new role really thought that he wanted Russia to become more integrated into the West. He talked about Russia joining NATO and things like that. So in the beginning, he was sort of putting feelers out. Now, how did he create the system that he has today? So first of all, and let's go back now to what happened after he took over. He summoned the oligarchs who had supported Yeltsin. They enriched themselves under Yeltsin, and many of them owned the major media outlets in Russia at that time. And Putin told them that they could keep their ill-gotten financial gains, however they'd gotten them, as long as they stayed out of politics. Most of the oligarchs listened to that. One of them in particular, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was running the most profitable private oil company in Russia and had just had a lot of Westerners put on the board of his company. He did not. He continued to criticize Russia and challenge Putin publicly. Khodorkovsky, and in 2003, he was arrested. He spent 10 years in a labor camp, and his Yukos oil company was taken over by Rosneft, whose CEO, Igor Sechin, is arguably the second most powerful man in Russia after Vladimir Putin. And the jailing of Khodorkovsky and the seizure of his private oil company, and I would say the semi-nationalization of it, it's a complicated issue, was the beginning of the turn of Putin towards a much more authoritarian state. And then the rest of the Yeltsin oligarchs, particularly those who owned the major media holdings, they were all exiled. And the few that remained behind in Russia really very much had to toe the line. So In the 21 years since Putin has been in power, the electronic media now have come completely, totally under the control of the Russian state. There's one independent television station, TV Rain, Dorzht, but that is no longer, it's only online. You can't watch it on your TV screen. And there's one independent radio station, the Echo of Moscow, Echo Moskvy, and that still functions pretty independently. But otherwise, the state tries to control all the sources of information. Now, unlike in the Soviet era, there is, of course, an internet. And unlike China, Russia has not yet managed to control the internet. So most Russians, or those that have access to the internet, do have access to other sources of information. Once again, we hear Putin, actually through Medvedev recently, say that they want to create a sovereign internet and to cut Russia off from the World Wide Web. But I think it's going to be very difficult to do that given where they are now. Putin has slowly created an authoritarian, or recreated the authoritarian Russian state by systematically curtailing personal freedoms and political competition, and by using increasingly coercive measures to punish critics. For the first 8 years of his time in power, oil prices rose. Russia got over the economic woes of the 1990s, and GDP rose by 7% per year. So the population standard of living really rose under Putin, and they liked him for that. They believed that he had brought stability to Russia, their lives were getting better, and the compact they had with him was that they wouldn't criticize his politics or really get very interested or involved in politics as long as he delivered the economic goods to them. And that really worked well until 2008. But after oil prices started to fall, and particularly in the period leading up to the annexation of Crimea, his popularity was beginning to fall again. However, once Crimea was annexed, his popularity shot up. And since then, particularly since 2014, he has portrayed himself as the one stable leader who can protect the Russian people against the West. The West has now become almost completely demonized. The United States, some of the European countries, but particularly the US, where Putin says the US is trying to tear up Russia, to cause regime change there, and trying to weaken the Russian state. So he has increasingly appealed Putin, as many of his predecessors in the Soviet period did, to kind of the West as the, if you like, as the dialectical enemy. Political competition has been severely curtailed by Putin, particularly in the last 10 years. No political party that is not controlled by the Kremlin is allowed to sit in the Duma, and the four official, they're official parties, but the four other parties that sit in the Duma really are supported by the Kremlin. Even the communists who say that they oppose Putin are very careful in what they do. So United Russia is the ruling party. Putin isn't its head, but somehow he has tied his own legitimacy to the success, the popularity of the United Russia Party. The famous former prime minister of Russia, Viktor Chernomyrdin, once said, you know, we always try and create new parties, but we always end up creating the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. That's really not completely true of United Russia, because it really doesn't have very much of its own platform, and it certainly doesn't really have its own ideology. But again, it is seen as an important vehicle for the pretense that Russia is a democracy or a managed democracy, and that people can go out. Elections are very important. They're held regularly in Russia, and it is part of this new authoritarian system under Putin that the United Russia Party must be seen to be a legitimate party. So the essence of the Putin system, and I'm now going to quote a Russian colleague of mine, is that Russia is run by the people who own it. And this is sort of different from at least the Soviet era. Whether we call it Russia Inc., whether we call it a kleptocracy, Putin's inner circle is composed of very wealthy people who thrive on the rents that they derive from Russia's natural resources, oil, gas, and all the precious metals that Russia has. Putin is the most powerful man in this system, but he is not all powerful. He depends on different groups. We can call them political clans, whatever we're going to call them, different groups of people who support him, just as they depend on him for their continued prosperity and liberty. So you have a pact here between Putin and these elites, which really ensures that they want to stay in power as long as they can, to keep what they have as long as they can, and not to face really any obstacles to that. And this is a lot of this is very much like the system even in Tsarist Russia. Informal mechanism and personal politics are key. Formal institutions tell you very little about how the Putin system functions in Russia. And I would refer anyone who wants to think about the history of this to the classical essay by the late historian Edward Keenan, Moscow Political Folkways, describing how the system worked under the Tsars. And how the Tsar and his elites always needed each other. Now, what's different is that it's highly personalistic now. And unlike in the communist period, the Secret Service people, the Siloviki, the people who surround Putin, who all come from the security services, really can act unchecked. Even in the communist period, you had a communist party, and that party did have some control over the security people. Okay. This is not the Soviet Union. There's no universalistic ideology anymore, which I think is a very important difference. Putin has created a sort of semi-ideology designed to appeal to the Ruski mir, the Russian world, the Russian speakers who live in the diaspora outside of Russia, be they in Ukraine or Brighton Beach or Kazakhstan. And it's to present Russia as a unique civilization, one that is superior to that of the West, and a conservative Christian bulwark against the kind of decadent West, which is portrayed in sort of by the official Russian commentators and things like that as decadent and against traditional values. So it is a different, it's a new, if you like, ideology or national idea, but they're not. But the Russians aren't trying to get adherents all around the world. It's really aimed at this Russian-speaking diaspora. Some people call Russia a managed democracy. I don't really think that that's the right term for it. It is an authoritarian society, but there are still personal freedoms. You do have the freedom to travel, unlike in the Soviet period. In fact, the Kremlin welcomes that. If you don't like what they're doing, you can leave. Nobody prevents you from leaving. Certain groups of people who work in sensitive positions can't travel anymore, but the average Russian person can, and that's a huge difference to what existed before. There is also, the rule of law has never been established in Russia. They began to try and do it, of course, under Gorbachev. There are laws, but if anything, any cases tied to politics at all, then the decisions from the judges and everything are decided beforehand, as they were in the Soviet times, and there is no objective rule of law. Now, Putin's Russia, and I'm coming to my final point now, faces the same problem that all authoritarian leaders do, and I come back to what we've talked about with previous Russian leaders: succession. There is very little precedent in Russian history except for a peaceful transfer of power, except what happened when Putin took over from Yeltsin. But of course, as we know again, the people around Yeltsin didn't do so well after that. And so Putin really has a dilemma here. Last year, the constitution was changed. Putin can now stay in power until 2036, by which time he would have been in power 10 years longer than Stalin was. And I'm not necessarily saying he will, but he has the ability to do that. He justified changing the constitution by saying Russia is a young country. A lot of things were done very quickly after the Soviet collapse. It's a fragile state, and I, Vladimir Putin, I'm your guarantor of stability. And we have to make sure that we get through this. And of course, the COVID pandemic and all of its adverse effects on Russia also, I think, helped to make that argument. So we have seen recently protests in Russia, which were occasioned by Alexei Navalny's arrest when he returned to Russia after being poisoned and being treated in Germany. A lot of the people out in the streets were young. They were in their 20s. This was all over Russia. I was tempted to say, you know, they look upon their lives, they look back to the Brezhnev era of stagnation, but maybe it wasn't one of stagnation, as we've just heard. But for these young people, the only ruler they've known is Putin. They look out and they see a group of increasingly aged men, and this is a parallel to the Brezhnev era, who could be in power for a very long time, and they want something different. And that's why they went out on the streets. They're not on the streets at the moment because they agreed not to do that, but they may come out again. So we see a veneer of stability here, but underneath we know that a younger generation is questioning how long this is going to go on, and frankly, whether they want to live in a country that has such an antagonistic relationship with the West, because they want to travel, they want to do things, they want more agency. Putin remains popular in the provinces, and in some of the smaller towns. He's not popular in a place like Moscow or St. Petersburg in some of the larger cities, but his popularity ratings, even though they're falling, are still pretty good compared to those of many Western leaders. 50% of the Russian population say they want change. 25% of the Russian population say they don't. Only 25% of the Russian population say that they trust Putin. And so, you know, there are many question marks there, but I think it's very easy often for people in the West to say, Russia can't go on like this, something's going to change. And often it doesn't change. And then sometimes we're very surprised by it. So my final words are that we know at least two eternal truths about Russia. Nothing is quite what it appears to be. And even the most sophisticated experts have been completely taken by surprise by unforeseen events there. So Russia looks stable until it isn't.
Thank you very much indeed. There were so many questions I wanted to ask you, but you've already answered all of them. So I think we should immediately go to the Q&A session. But before we do that, I would like to have a bit of a commercial break. And now you're surprised, I'm sure. You think that Apple has given us some money or Coca-Cola, but they haven't. I just wanted to advertise the books of our four speakers. And here is Hiroaki Kuromiya, his two books, of which I mentioned at the beginning, Stalin, Profile in Power, coming out with Longman, and a book, Conscience on Trial, about pacifists in Stalin's Ukraine. Hiroaki has had to leave us a short while ago as he has to do some teaching, but please remember his books. And then I would like to point out Bill Taubman's books. That would be the book on Khrushchev, the man and his era, which is well known and a very good read. So I can recommend it to you, of course. And his latest book on Gorbachev, His Life and Times, which came out with Simon & Schuster in 2017. And all the books I mentioned here are, of course, available via Amazon. And of course, don't forget our local bookstores and your local bookstores. But they certainly are all a good read. And that brings me to Donald Rawley. And Donald's well-known book is Soviet Baby Boomers, an oral history of Russia's Cold War generation, that came out with Oxford University Press in 2013. That other book, his biography of Leonid Brezhnev, is still in the making. So we look forward to reading that book perhaps in a couple of years' time. And it certainly promises to be a very good read. And that brings me to Angela Stent's two books, which I would like to mention here. That is first the book, The Limits of Partnership, US-Russian Relations in the 21st Century, Princeton University Press 2014, and her latest book coming out, or which came out in 2019, Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. A very good read. I've actually recently started reading it, and it's very good and insightful indeed. Thank you very much, Pete. And that brings us definitely to the Q&A session. Brianna, are you still with us? I'm not quite sure, but Pete, could you ask the first question, please?
Happily, we have a question from Alan Vo, and I think this question was to Mr. Kuromiya, but we'll offer it to Mr. Raleigh. In your view, what were Stalin's principal goals in the period immediately following World War II?
What were Stalin's?
Yes, sir. Stalin's goals.
What were Stalin's principal goals following World War II?
Yes, sir.
Well, you know, I think here we have to consider the impact of the war on the Soviet Union. With 27 million war dead, this was not publicized at the time, to be sure. Arguably, the Soviet Union, it was perceived as a superpower because of the Red Army's march into and liberation of Europe, but I would argue it was as strong as the economy, which is devastated, right? So my sense is that Stalin wanted to keep the extent of the destruction and the weakness of the Soviet state, keep it not only from potential foreign aggressors, but also from the Soviet people, because of course someone would have to be accountable as to why. And at the same time, it was very important to him to have this buffer zone in Eastern Europe, right? Because Imperial Russia was invaded during World War I, and then Soviet Russia not that long afterwards. So these were critical, I think, critical objectives of his, wanting at least friendly governments on the border. It's interesting to speculate about the Cold War, right? Was it something that could have been avoided in any way? And there is a work by a historian that's taken the so-called emotional turn, looking at the role that emotions play in making in rational decision making, right? And particularly in trust. In this particular case, the author emphasizes the relationship between Stalin and Roosevelt during the Yalta talks in particular, and argues that the two of them got along very well and developed a level of trust, and that if Roosevelt had not died, it was possible perhaps that the Cold War, as we know it, could have been avoided in some way. Now, again, that's speculation, but it raises this important question of these soft methodologies, but the importance of them, right? What happens when leaders meet and negotiate, right? What are the factors that go into the decisions that are made, the complexity of it all? So
that talks about normal times beyond COVID, when the actual it's all Zoom. Thank you, Don. Can I ask Bill also a question about Stalin? And here are two questions which I'm going to merge. Was the terror, Stalin's terror, actually totally necessary for his rule? Would otherwise his rule would have collapsed? And is there a possibility to compare present-day North Korea to what the Soviet Union was like under Stalin?
I think the extent of Stalin's terror suggests that it was not entirely rational. And to go back to the theme that I discussed during my presentation, I think that the extent of Stalin's terror reflected his character, his paranoia. I've argued with Steve Kotkin, who's writing this new 3-volume history of a biography of Stalin. And Kotkin said he disagreed with this view. He said, no, he said, every tyrant ends up destroying the people around him. And so Stalin was not unique. But when I look back at the Bolshevik leaders other than Stalin, I don't think any of them would have destroyed millions as Stalin did. They were brutal. They were ready to destroy their enemies. They would have destroyed thousands, but this mad attempt to destroy people, not only who were enemies, but who might become enemies or whom he imagined would be enemies, was madness. And so in that sense, the whole experience of terror was, as I said, irrational.
And is there a justification to compare it with North Korea or not really?
I don't know. I don't know enough about North Korea. My impression is that the North Koreans, or at least the initial one, Kim Il-sung, modeled himself on Stalin, just as for a while Mao did before he exceeded Stalin in the terror in China. But of course, Stalin did not pass the baton to his sons or daughter the way the North Koreans have. And by the time you get down the chain to Kim Jong-un, it beats me as to exactly what is going on in his head.
Thank you. Pete, do you have another question?
Yes, we have a couple questions, and we'll direct this to Dr. Stent. If you could elaborate as to the relationship that President Trump had with Putin.
Okay, the eternal question. President Trump first visited the Soviet Union in 1987. Gorbachev was opening up all of these opportunities for Western investment. President Trump was very interested in possibly building, a Trump Tower or property there. And so he started visiting the Soviet Union and then Russia, on a fairly regular basis after that. So this is by way of saying that the Russians knew him. Any prominent American business person going there, they're going to get to know, they're going to keep their files on them. So they knew him. And then, of course, he did have the Miss Universe contest there in, I believe, 2011. And that's when he invited President Putin to come and meet him. President Putin couldn't come and meet him, but I think he sent some kind of a message back. So by the time you get to the 2016 election campaign, one of President Trump's promises was, we get along with Russia. Why shouldn't we? He had these ideas, I think, also about some kind of grand arms control deals. He talked about that when he was a younger man, too. And from President Putin's point of view, seeing Donald Trump on the campaign trail, praising President Putin, this was very welcome to them. They knew Hillary Clinton. They didn't particularly like Hillary Clinton. In 2011, when people had gone out on the streets demonstrating against Putin, Clinton had criticized Putin, and then Putin had criticized her for paying the demonstrators to go out in the streets. Anyway, there was no love lost between them. And so obviously you then had, during the 2016 campaign, the Russian interference in favor of President Trump. And once he became president, he was really pretty consistent. We know that he had, one major bilateral summit with President Putin in 2018. They only had their interpreters there. There were no note takers, so we don't quite know what happened. He praised President Putin all the time. President Putin always praised him, even though President Putin had criticized America all the time. He never criticized Trump. So people obviously ask, what else is there to know? Is there something going on there that we don't know about? I would just say, I think we should wait and see what happens with all of the tax returns of President Trump's and what we find out about them. His son has said that in 2008, when no one would lend the Trump organization any money after the crash, they borrowed a lot from Russian entities. There are obviously business connections there with Russia. That doesn't necessarily, of course, involve President Putin. And I think the final thing I would say is President Trump obviously admired strongmen leaders. We look at what he did with Chairman Kim Jong-un. In the beginning, the relationship with President Xi Jinping, obviously that changed. With Erdogan, one can think of a number of leaders like that, including President Putin, who are authoritarian leaders. And President Trump obviously saw something in that appealed to him. So that's what we know now. We may, at some point in the future, know more.
Thank you, Angela. Let me follow up before Pete perhaps then picks another question not regarding Putin. Here's a question from David Litt, who asks, and I summarize, what the hell is Putin doing in Syria? And what are his connections to the Assads? What are his personal attitudes, his personal involvement, but also what are his strategic objectives?
Okay, so, the Soviet Union first and then Russia has long ties to Syria. These are relations that go back certainly to the Soviet period. After the Soviet collapse, clearly the Soviet Union, withdrew largely from the Middle East, but the ties with Syria were there. So then you get the rise of the Islamic State, and you have, according to Putin, at least 4,000 fighters going from Russia, either Russian citizens or Central Asians who were living in Russia. They were the second largest foreign contingent fighting for the Islamic State. In 2015, it looked as if the Assad regime might lose the civil war. And that, of course, is when Putin came to the United Nations in September, had a conversation with President Obama, and then shortly thereafter, the Defense Department was given 1 hour's notice and the Russians began bombing in Syria. And so I would say there are two things going on here. One is because of Russia, the Assad has survived. And whatever happens when the civil war is over, Russia will have a say in who might succeed him. They'll have to work out the relationship with Iran going forward, where their interests are not necessarily the same in Syria. They now have a modernized air base and port facilities in Syria, but they've used their incursion into Syria to really reestablish Russia's presence in the Middle East, going back to parts of the Middle East from which they withdrew after the Soviet collapse. And they are now seen in the Middle East really as an honest broker, because unlike the United States, which of course sees Iran as a major enemy there, antagonist, if you like, the Russians don't. They talk to all sides on all issues. They've established close ties both with Saudi Arabia and Israel, both of whom are, of course, US allies, and both of whom hope that Russia can, in fact, use its influence on Iran to temper what Iran's doing. So what Russia is doing in Syria is ensuring that it will remain a presence in the Middle East, and that it will have a say in what happens once the civil war is over. And its preference was to have its fighters die in Syria than to have them come back to the Russian Federation and increase the dangers of terrorism there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pete.
We'll offer this question to Donald Rawley. What was Brezhnev's role in the invasion of Afghanistan in late 1979, and was that a rejection of his devotion to peace?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was anticipating that, and also in the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. But let me just say that, I want to emphasize again after 75 that Brezhnev was really in ill health. And it was a rump Politburo that made the decision to invade. And Brezhnev had doubts, but he was finally, Gromyko, Andropov, several members of the Politburo, who probably ought to have known better. They were convinced, first of all, that they might lose Afghanistan to the US. And secondly, that a strategic intervention would be short-term and effective. They were dead wrong on this. So they convinced Brezhnev. So he did sign off on it, but with regrets. And I want to point out that the next year, the invasion of Poland was discussed by the Politburo with the rise of solidarity. And the military historian Volkoganov, who was no friend of Brezhnev, who really wrote very dismissively of him, in this regard points out that Brezhnev's role in resisting any intervention in Poland was extremely important. That if it hadn't been for Brezhnev, the Soviet Union might have considered and might have actually invaded. So I think Brezhnev was, again, realized that the invasion of Afghanistan was a mistake, and he didn't want to make it again. He was much more cautious regarding Poland.
Thank you. And is it true that the Politburo was divided, that it was a narrow decision to go into Afghanistan?
It was a small group of people that were there to make the vote. It wasn't a full meeting of the Politburo. And people like Georgy Arbatov, who was head of the Institute of USA and Canada, and certainly one of the architects of Perestroika, Arbatov exonerates Brezhnev. He said he was this old, frail man, right? And he was listening to advice of people he thought were in the know. But they were the ones who really are to blame, because they should have known better.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks very much. A question from one of our PhD students, Mark Reeves, perhaps for Bill Taubman. He says that throughout, it comes through throughout the presentations, that a disorderly transfer of power in the Soviet Union was both a weakness and seemed to be an inherent part of the system. Could there have been anything done about that, or was it really part of the system?
I remember when I was in graduate school, taking a course with Zbigniew Brzezinski, later became the American National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter. This was one of his big themes, about the succession struggle built in to the Soviet system, not avoidable easily, if at all. I suppose it goes back to the prior condition, which is struggle for power within the elite at the top among the people in the Politburo. As long as there is such a struggle, it's difficult to avoid a chaotic or disorderly succession. Now, if Putin managed to be ushered into power by Yeltsin, who was relatively weak compared to the way Putin seems to be now, I suppose it's possible to imagine Putin ushering in somebody else. I don't think, I mean, in the Soviet times, if you think back to the Stalin succeeding Lenin and Khrushchev succeeding Stalin and Brezhnev succeeding Khrushchev and Gorbachev succeeding, well, at that point it was Chernenko, those were all, except for maybe the last one, they were all contested by relatively equal, or so it seemed at the time, contenders. Whereas now, we don't know who the contenders are, and we have no idea whether, if they do exist or will exist, how equally or unequally they will be balanced against each other. So I don't know. I think it's possible there'll be another struggle to succeed, but it's also possible it will be more like the Putin succession after Yeltsin. One other interesting thing is that in these succession struggles, it's interesting that the people who were thought to be lesser were the ones who won for a while. Trotsky seemed to be the more dominant figure, but Stalin was viewed by many of their colleagues as a kind of gray clerk, but he succeeded. Khrushchev, as I argued in my presentation, was, or maybe I didn't, I meant to argue it, Khrushchev was seen as lesser than the others, who Molotov, Malenkov, Beria, and he won. Brezhnev was not seen, as Don Rawley said, as the dominant figure. There were other contenders like Shelepin and Podgorny and Kosygin, and yet Brezhnev won out. And then when we get to Gorbachev, well, that was a little different. They agreed pretty quickly on him. But what I'm saying is there's a tendency towards struggle. The nature of the struggle depends on the balance of power among the contenders, and we really don't know what that will all look like comes the day, whenever it comes, when Putin passes off the scene.
And you've written on Gorbachev recently. So was there a chance that the kind of Yeltsin-style semi-democracy, to call it that, could have been continued once Putin took over, or was that never really on the table at all?
You mean, could Russia have remained more democratic in the Yeltsin style?
Yeah, under Putin, the early Putin years, yeah.
Yeah, well, as Angela said, there were some hints early on, and some witnesses who took the hints seriously, that Putin actually was interested in a cooperative relationship with the West, a relationship with NATO, maybe even joining it. He was the first to call President Bush after 9/11 bombings. He helped arrange for Americans sending troops and planes to Afghanistan to use bases in Central Asia. I can't forget this. I had a very talented undergraduate student who back in those days wrote a thesis, a senior thesis on Putin, and came to the conclusion that Putin was a Democrat in his heart. It looked as if that was a terrible mistake, but I remember reading the speeches and the quotes it was based on, and it was plausible. But Russia's tradition is strongman leadership. There's very little, if any, experience with democracy, maybe 6 months in 1917, the Gorbachev years, the Yeltsin years off and on. So it's very hard with a base of that kind to hope for a steady development of democracy. Gorbachev actually, when I interviewed him during the years I was working on the book, I had the sense that he was debating with himself the question of whether he was moving too fast or too slow toward democracy. And I think at the time, he felt he was moving too slowly. Indeed, after he was ousted, in his early comments about what had happened, he said he'd wished he'd moved faster toward a market economy and a democratic polity. But I think more recently than that, he feels that he moved too fast, because at least one quote that I read from some years ago, Gorbachev said, it will take decades and perhaps the whole of the 21st century for Russia to become democratic.
Thank you. Pete, do you have some more questions?
Yes, we have a couple questions concerning Putin's financial situation, and we'll offer this question to Dr. Stent. What is a reasonable estimate of Putin's current net worth?
Your guess is as good as mine. You know, some people say he's the richest man in the world. Is it 40 billion? Is it 100 billion? I have no idea. Nobody has really, I mean, maybe some people do have a better idea, but you know, as people know, it's not that you're going to find bank accounts with his name on it. So a lot of this is very speculative.
What about that palace which was recently discovered? Is that his or not?
Well, again, it's not in his name. It's being funded by other people. This is part of the system that they have. Is it being built for his use? I think that's quite plausible. But again, and then subsequently, one of his very close friends came out and said that in fact the palace was being built for him. So we'll have to see.
Thank you. Pete, another question?
And can I just say, I sent you an email. I'm afraid I have another meeting that I have to go to. So
sure.
I'm going to have to leave.
Yeah, thank you very much for participating.
Okay.
Much appreciated.
Thanks.
Yeah, we are running out of time quickly, but we have plenty of questions. If the Don and Bill can bear with us for a little while, this will be appreciated. Let's take another 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour, and then we'll say goodbye for tonight. Pete, do you have another question?
Sure, and we can offer this to Mr. Raleigh. How do you see U.S. and Russia relations, and who is responsible for the current divisions? Is it as one-sided as it would appear?
Yeah, great question. It always takes two parties in a relationship, right? And I in thinking back upon Brezhnev, and he developed this relationship with Nixon, and then shortly after his visit to the United States, Nixon is out of office, Willy Brandt is out of office, the French president, these people he collaborated with are no longer on the scene, and politics change. And the Soviets had a terribly difficult time responding to this and making sense of this. Brezhnev tried to reinvigorate détente, Andropov did, even Chernenko did, but it was already a different issue because there were different people here in power. I think now, obviously, I have real concerns. I found it sort of ironic that elements of the American public that historically would have always blamed Russia for the difficult relationship, because they supported President Trump, immediately just switched sides. The Russians aren't that bad after all, and are supporting Putin in Russia in a way that I just found the reversal just so dramatic and puzzling in some ways. I am concerned that there might be a lasting legacy of the Cold War, and it may even predate that, but an anti-Russian or even a Russophobic element and trend in our own culture that sometimes gets in the way of improving relationships. I think we have a chance now with the new administration here, but from what I've read, the new administration already has its mind made up about Putin and Russia, largely in negative terms and hostile. I would hope that there'd be more openness to dialogue. I think there are a lot of places for lots of common ground here for constructive dialogue and even collaborative ventures and ways to possibly improve that relationship. Without sort of whitewashing, the Putin administration and era. I pretty much agree with everything Angela said about it, but I am concerned about the changes here, the attitudes here.
Okay, thanks very much. Here's also a question from Craig Horn, one of our representatives in Raleigh. And Craig is asking, can Putin's power system really be sustained? Can he really function as was described by Angela Stent just before with his oligarchic system? And can you also in that context, Bill, perhaps comment on the protests which are going on in Russia and whether that really endangers his power base? Including perhaps the Navalny scandal, the Navalny affair. How serious does Putin need to take that?
I think the first thing to be said about can he sustain it is look how long he already has sustained it. I think he, depending on how you count it, he's already up there with Stalin. Stalin, well, it depends on when you say he took over, let's say 29. And then you get to 53 when he dies, and Putin becomes president in 1999. And here we are in 2021. I mean, this is quite a feat to have sustained it this long. As Angela said, and other commentators have said, the longer he sustains it, the harder it gets to be to continue to sustain it. But I don't think they're anywhere close to being ready for him to either leave or for people to kick him out. As Don or maybe it was Angela said, Putin is still quite popular. Navalny got people out into the streets, but now he's been sent away to Siberia, or not Siberia, I gather it's near Vladimir, to a terrible prison camp there for 2 or 3 years. God knows whether he'll ever emerge alive. The people who go into the street are rounded up, many of them. I think if a change comes, it would be more likely to be triggered by a split at the top, which is the way it's often been. When the elite splits, then things become possible in the streets, or the elite or one element of the elite ousts another. But we frankly don't know. I certainly don't know. Maybe Angela does. We don't know enough about the people around Putin or in the military to know if any of them are getting impatient with him and beginning to think that the Putin system, which they are helping him to run and from which they're benefiting, might do better without him. We just don't know.
Thank you. A quick follow-up question asked by Emery Ergunger. What about Putin and China, Russia and China? Does Putin really like to be the junior partner to a rising China? Because that is the way it looks like at the moment. Will that friendship be sustained?
Whom are you posing this to, Klaus?
To you, Bill.
Well, I would say the answer is no. He does not like being the junior partner. When you think back to the years when the Soviet Union was the senior partner under Stalin, and then even under Khrushchev, and Mao rebelled against that, and then the Chinese became stronger and stronger and Soviet Union collapsed. I'm sure they find it very painful. But on the other hand, they know it's in their interest in Moscow to be working with the Chinese and to make the Americans worried about that alliance, or at least that relationship. So I think even if they don't love it at the moment, they're content to develop it, or at least to keep it from disintegrating.
So you don't see a Sino-Russian split anytime soon?
I don't, but on the other hand, I don't know enough about it to be a reliable witness.
Okay, thank you very much. Pete, do we have another question? You're muted. Pete, you're muted.
Oh my gosh, my bad. How reliable and complete are Soviet records regarding Stalin's actions, especially his brutal actions? And we'll offer this to Mr. Rawley.
Well, here's where we need Hiroaki. I don't know, Don, are you?
Well, with the opening of the archives, we've learned some interesting things about the nature of Gulag. We also learned, for instance, that there had long been the opinion that there were soft Bolsheviks within the leadership who opposed Stalin and the terror. But we now know, thanks to the archives, that there were no soft Bolsheviks in the top leadership. They signed off on the Great Terror. We also know that there were more people in Gulag after World War II than there were in the 1930s. We usually associate the height of the terror with the 1930s. And until about 1937, there were many people who were able to escape from camp. It was a very, it was a borderland. It was the Wild West in a way. So we've again, about 22 million people passed through the doors. It was a revolving door. And the peak was late 40s, and it was for people violating labor discipline in the post-war era in an attempt to rebuild the economy. So we have learned some interesting things. The KGB records on the mid-30s, most of that has been made available, and there are some excellent studies that have come out in Europe and the United States based on fundamental archival research with this material. There are gaps in all state records, but the numbers of people in camp, the number of deaths, that information was recorded.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Maybe I'll ask a question, the final question, before asking you a very final question to sum up things, and that would be the almost final question about Belarus and Ukraine. Both are unhappy with Putin, but Putin is still insisting on putting his rule, his kneel abroad over these countries. Is the situation is the status quo we have at the moment, is that sustainable, or will there be more protests? Will there be an uprising against Russia's influence in eastern Ukraine and also in Belarus? Can you speculate about this? I would say to both of you, but let's start with Bill.
I'm actually tempted to answer a previous question.
Okay.
And that was the question as to who's responsible, the balance of responsibility between the United States and Russia for the new Cold War. Can I take a shot at that?
Absolutely.
If you go back and look at Putin's explanations as to what's gone wrong and why Russia is so upset with the United States, he makes a pretty good case, or at least you could certainly understand why the events and developments that he cites could have indeed alarmed Putin and the Russians. For example, the expansion of NATO all the way to include the Baltic states, and even the possible expansion of NATO, which the United States talked about, although it never really acted on it, to include Ukraine and Georgia. Or take the Kosovo war, where the United States moved against Yugoslavia, a long-time friend of Russia. Or Libya, where you remember Medvedev was the president of Russia at the time, and Russia abstained in the Security Council when the Security Council passed a resolution authorizing the use of force to save the people of, I forget the name of the city, begins with a B. Anyway, from being crushed by Colonel Gaddafi. And what happened?
Benghazi.
What, sorry?
Benghazi.
Benghazi, right. But what happened in the end was the West went ahead and eliminated Gaddafi, which was more than Medvedev had approved of. So there are a whole series of things that Putin cites, which have the ring of plausibility to them. You could see how Russia would be alarmed by this. But the question I always ask myself is, let's imagine that these things hadn't happened. Would Putin have lived happily ever after with the West and with the United States? Or would he have found another reason or other sets of grievances to hold against the West? Because, and here's the speculation, because Russia, it turns out, has needed, as in some ways the Soviet Union did, an external enemy to justify the controls it's putting on its own people at home. So although I can understand his case, and I can even begin to imagine myself in his shoes being alarmed, as he says he was, I'm not finally convinced that it was the United States moves that really explain the development of the new Cold War, especially since once Putin decided that Russia was being threatened by the West, then of course he started making his own moves, like seizing Crimea and moving into Ukraine and threatening the Baltics and interfering in the 2016 American election, all of which had the effect of alarming the United States.
Thank you. What we can notice when we look at current history is that the United States has developed an ever more harsher position towards both Russia and also China, while the Western Europeans, in particular, the Central Europeans, not so much the Eastern Europeans, but the Western Europeans, like, for example, Germany, seem to be much more understanding towards both Putin and Xi Jinping, without, being in agreement, but they have a certain greater understanding than seems to exist in Washington. Do you see that is justified, that is not justified, and this will split the Western world in the end?
Don, you care to respond to that one?
Well, I think in general, Klaus, I would agree that there are very different views in Europe, but maybe not the UK. I think that we have very similar attitudes, and even the Russophobia, very similar to what's going on in Britain.
Well, there's a reason why there was Brexit after all.
So they're not part of Europe. Yeah, I sometimes feel that our concerns are sort of they lack a certain. Well, I mean, I think of what was going on the last 4 years with the State Department, right, and the erosion of knowledgeable State Department people who were resigning or whose views weren't respected, and what goes into decision making here can be very erratic, and we often talk about Russia needing an other to mobilize the population. I think we do too, in a way. Definition begins with negation. We're not that, right? We're not China. We're not Russia. And that works to a certain extent, but it has its real limitations, and I have concerns about it, certainly.
Thank you. Bill, the final word to you.
Well, I hate to have the last word, but what I was going to say was that I am not a fan of Donald Trump, but I thought he had some good points about Russia when he said that both the sides, US and Russia, had contributed to the development of greater tensions between the two. And when he said we had certain common interests with Russia that we should work on. And when he expressed a desire to work on them himself. I think the big mistake he made was to seem, and perhaps in fact to be, a patsy for Putin, so that many people in the United States were not prepared to trust him to do the work of mitigating, insofar as possible, the current tensions and developing, insofar as desirable, the possibilities for cooperation. Now, he's gone, Biden's in. Biden is already looking for ways to cooperate without setting a reset with Russia. And I think that's good, but I do worry about the way in which we have in the United States settled on the assumption that the Russians are dangerous and Putin is nothing but a thug. He's a thug in certain ways, but he's also a very skillful operator and a statesman who is, I think, prepared to do a certain amount of business with the United States when he thinks it's in Russia's interest.
So are you calling for a new policy of re-engagement with Russia?
Well, I'm calling for a policy of engagement with Russia, which is aware of and alert to and doesn't accept many things about Russia, but is also understands that it's in our interest as well as Russia to work on things that are in the common interest.
That sounds to me like a very reasonable position. Thank you very much indeed. I would love to thank Hiroaki Kuromiya, who has left us an hour ago because he needed to do some teaching. Then thank you very much to Angela Stent, who also had to go to a meeting. And I very much appreciate that Donald Rawley and William Taubman were here until the very bitter end. I hope the two of you enjoyed it. I certainly did. I learned a lot, and we still have a large audience with us, despite over 2 hours of very interesting talks and discussions. So thank you very much for all four of you, and particularly, of course, to Donald Rawley and Bill Taubman for coming and joining us today. It was really the most interesting and enlightening. And I would like to tell our remaining audience that our next event will be on the 24th of March, and then we will have an event about Henry Kissinger, and we will discuss whether Henry Kissinger was visionary and wise or reckless and evil. And we will consider that from all sorts of angles. But for tonight, I would like to thank everyone, particularly our speakers and participants and our audience, and of course, Pete and Brianna, our Krasno assistants. Thank you very much, and good night to everyone.
Thank you, Klaus. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, good seeing you.
Good night. And of course, we will upload the video onto our YouTube channel within a day or two. Good night.
Good night.